Hey, what's up? Welcome back to your channel name. This time, we're going to dive into a story that will make you think twice before walking alone at night. Grab some snacks, turn off the lights, and listen closely. A morning fog blanketed the cobbled streets of Winscombe as a black carriage pulled to a stop before the rusted gates of Elmhurst Academy. The old school stood like a sleeping giant, waiting to be disturbed, its red brick walls weathered by time, ivy creeping along the cracked windows, and a clock tower frozen in a perpetual silence. Through the mist stepped a tall, slender woman dressed in all black, her long coat swaying like a shadow. She carried a worn leather suitcase, aged and battered, its brass clasps dulled by time. No one greeted her. No one even knew she was coming. Miss Eloane Mire, her name appeared in the school's visitor logbook, written in ink that hadn't been used in decades. The administration staff insisted no notice of her hiring had been received. Yet when the headmaster saw the name, his expression turned pale, his eyes sinking into memory as though recognizing a ghost long buried. Without protest, Eloane was given an appointment letter and the key to room 7. A classroom that had remained sealed for decades after a student had vanished there in 1974. There was no official welcome, no inquiries about her credentials, no interviews. It all happened as if it had been preordained, like a promise whispered through time, finally fulfilled. That day, the air around Elmhurst grew colder. The fog, which normally lifted by noon, clung to the grounds like a second skin. The birds that usually gathered atop the tower were silent, and only the wind remained, howling faintly as if greeting someone who should never have returned. Miss Eloane didn't resemble any teacher the school had ever known. Her skin was ghostly pale, almost translucent like wet marble. The cold never touched her cheeks, her complexion remained unchanged regardless of weather. Her long black hair was always immaculately combed back, framing her colorless face and eyes that bore the color of storm clouds. When she smiled, it never reached her eyes. It was a gesture, nothing more. Forced and hollow, like muscle memory imitating what she thought was human. Students entering room 7 for the first time in decades sensed the strangeness. The air was heavier there, colder. The silence was unnatural, as though the walls absorbed every whisper. Some students reported lightheadedness when seated near the windows. Others felt watched, even when Miss Eloane stood motionless at the front of the room with her icy gaze fixed forward. The other teachers whispered among themselves in the staff lounge. None could pinpoint what unsettled them so deeply, but all agreed, Miss Eloane was too quiet, too distant. She was never seen eating in the cafeteria, never joined conversations, never laughed. Each afternoon, she would walk toward the neglected eastern garden, a patch of land facing the forest beyond. There, she stood still for long minutes, watching the fog drift through the trees as if waiting for something to return her gaze. Room 7 should have remained locked. Tucked in the eastern wing of Elmhurst, it bordered a hallway that once belonged to the old monastery before it was absorbed into the school. It had been abandoned since a student named Jonathan disappeared during class in 1974. No trace of him was ever found. The room was sealed shortly after, and staff agreed silently never to speak of it again. Yet Miss Eloane requested that very room. Her request arrived in a handwritten letter, inked in a deep brown that smelled faintly of dried fungus. No one saw her deliver it, but it lay perfectly centered on the headmaster's desk. Once again, he could not refuse her. Something in him resisted the idea of denying her anything, as if the decision had already been made long ago. The moment room 7's door creaked open, a wave of chill seeped through the hallway. Over a single night, the room had transformed. The dust and cobwebs vanished, the aged desks gleamed as if recently varnished, and the cracked chalkboard stood intact. Yet no one witnessed any cleaner or worker enter. The students who returned to class the next day found it harder to breathe. Some heard faint footsteps above the ceiling. Others swore the lights flickered even without power surges. But the most disturbing feature was the clock on the wall, it never moved. Always fixed at 10:17 a.m., the exact time Jonathan had last been seen. Miss Alohan's lessons were unlike anything outlined in the official curriculum. She brought with her ancient tomes bound in cracked leather, titles never listed in any library archive. Their pages were brittle, written in archaic languages filled with tales of spectral teachers, cursed classrooms, and pupils who studied within dreams that never ended. Each lesson began with a recitation from one of those decaying books, whose pages bore what looked like handwritten scripts inked in something far darker than black. Her handwriting twisted unnaturally across the parchment, almost writhing. The content was deeply unsettling, concepts of twisted time, of spirits trapped in learning loops, endlessly repeating exams they could never complete. Soon, students could no longer separate waking life from dreams. They reported hearing her voice in their sleep, repeating phrases from class. The lessons never ended, they continued through the night in whispers, persistent and cold. Some awoke exhausted. Others couldn't remember going to bed at all. Other teachers didn't know what was being taught. Miss Alohan never shared a syllabus, never reported grades, never contributed during faculty meetings. Yet her students began to change. They grew pale, withdrawn, with sunken eyes and brittle fingernails. They seemed distant. As though their thoughts no longer belonged to them alone. On a rainy Tuesday morning, Miss Alohan didn't show up for class. For the first time since her arrival, room 7 sat empty. The students didn't celebrate. In fact, they grew anxious. Some of them reported feeling as though something had been unplugged from their minds. One student vomited without reason. Another fainted while writing in his notebook, eyes wide open and unblinking. Clara took the opportunity to sneak into room 7 with 2 friends. The door, usually locked when class was over, creaked open as if waiting. Inside, the atmosphere was different, heavier. It smelled of dust, candle wax, and decayed lilies. On the teacher's desk lay a journal bound in rough human-like skin. Its cover was warm to the touch. The students flipped through the entries, realizing with dread that the handwriting matched theirs, lines they never remembered writing. Phrases from dreams. Symbols they had never studied, etched in ink that shimmered red. On the last page was a sketch of the Eastern Wing corridor, with excess marking spots where students had disappeared since 1974. The final X was dated tomorrow. That night, Clara dreamed again. This time, it was different. The corridor had changed, longer, darker, with portraits on the walls. Each painting showed a child, eyes closed, names scratched into the gold frames. Jonathan's was among them. She saw her own portrait too, eyes just beginning to close. Alohan was there, standing at the end of the corridor, facing a stone door glowing faintly with runes. Behind her, shadowy figures murmured lessons. The voice that once whispered now sang in harmony, a low, droning chant that made Clara's bones vibrate. She awoke screaming. Her pillow was damp with river water. Soil stained her fingertips. The next morning, Miss Alohan returned to class, her expression serene. No one dared ask where she had been. Clara noticed a new necklace around her neck, a locket made of tarnished silver. When it swung slightly, she saw a small photo inside. It was her own face. During the final lesson that Friday, Miss Alohan gave no lecture. She merely stood before the class, motionless, while the door locked itself from the inside. The students felt frozen in place, unable to move or blink as the clock on the wall began to tick again, for the first time in decades. It ticked backward. One by one, the students began vanishing. Not violently, simply fading from their seats like sand swept from stone. Clara, paralyzed in her chair, watched her friends disappear, their expressions frozen in confusion. Their notebooks remained, open to pages filled with unfamiliar words and spiraling symbols. She tried to scream but no sound escaped. Miss Alohan turned to her then, raising a pale hand toward the back wall. It slowly began to open like a mouth unsealing. Light poured through, a cold, ancient light. Clara could feel herself being pulled toward it, not by force, but by invitation. As though her name had always been written there, waiting. At precisely 10:17 a.m., the bell atop Elmhurst Academy rang, a sound not heard in 50 years. The vibrations echoed through the halls, shattering classroom windows and sending birds scattering into the sky. Teachers rushed to the eastern wing, but room 7 was gone. In its place stood a blank wall of untouched stone, as though it had never existed. Clara's name disappeared from the student registry. Her locker was empty. Her photograph vanished from class portraits. The students who had shared dreams no longer remembered her, their memories rewritten with gaps they couldn't explain. Only one person remembered everything, the headmaster. He locked himself in his office that night and wrote one final note: "She has returned. The door will open again when the next name is written." That night, the fog returned, thick and choking. A black carriage was seen once again at the gates. Inside it, a man stepped out this time, tall, in a worn coat, holding a leather suitcase. He asked for room 7. The man who stepped from the carriage introduced himself to the faculty as Mr. Dorian Vale, a substitute literature instructor from an unnamed northern university. No one recalled requesting a replacement, yet his paperwork seemed in order. His accent was old-fashioned, and his gaze lingered too long on people's eyes, as though searching for something beneath the surface. He requested room 7 be reopened. When informed the room no longer existed, he simply nodded and requested to teach in the old library instead, a part of the building that had been sealed for decades due to structural issues. Strangely, after his request, the head janitor found the library door ajar, its hinges freshly oiled, and no sign of decay within. By Monday, the room was furnished. The walls bore books no one recalled ordering. Some had no titles, only textured spines. Students assigned to Mr. Vale's class reported strange symptoms. Recurring dreams of corridors, unfamiliar alphabets appearing in their margins, and a compulsive urge to return to the library even outside of class hours. Though Clara had vanished, something of her lingered. A week after her disappearance, one student named Emily found a folded note inside her own locker. It bore Clara's handwriting, confirmed by multiple friends, and contained only a single sentence: "Don't let him rewrite the ending." Emily tried to report the note, but it vanished from her hand before she reached the teacher's office. She began hearing Clara's voice during lessons, guiding her to specific books in the library, books written in ink that shimmered like Clara's blood had done. One page featured a portrait of Eloan, seated beside a man with Dorian Vale's unmistakable features, both sketched in a style centuries old. From then on, Emily started keeping a journal, convinced she was next. She felt the same pull Clara had described. Toward the sealed hallway, toward the wall that no longer whispered but now pulsed faintly beneath her fingertips like a heartbeat waiting to wake. Late one evening, Emily and 2 others returned to the library. They found the room rearranged. Desks had formed a circle. Candles burned in sconces without flame or smoke. In the center of the floor was a chalk circle with 7 names written inside it, 6 now crossed out. The 7th, Emily. The trio tried to erase the name, but the chalk wouldn't smudge. Instead, the floor around it cracked slightly, revealing a second layer of symbols beneath the wood, sigils identical to those Clara had documented in her final entries. That night, Emily dreamed she was underground, surrounded by books that whispered their own contents into her ears. She couldn't shut them out. One book opened to a page where her own face was carved in wax, its eyes slowly melting. When she awoke, the symbol from the floor was on her palm, branded in pale silver. Her parents would not see it. But every time she touched a mirror, her reflection blinked a second too late. The headmaster, who had once promised himself never to interfere again, finally descended into the basement archives, a maze of stone and mildew where old disciplinary records and occult confiscations were buried under dust and shame. There, he retrieved the black ledger, a forbidden register said to hold the names of students marked by the returning. Clara's name had faded entirely, but Emily's glowed faintly. Mr. Vale's was there too, scrawled in crimson, surrounded by annotations in Latin and Greek. The final entry in the book bore a chilling line: when 7 are taken, the door becomes a mouth. He returned to his office, burned the ledger, and mailed a resignation letter with no return address. He was last seen leaving campus at dusk, staring back only once, toward the old bell tower, where a silhouette watched him from behind the cracked glass. On the final day of the semester, the bell tolled once more, 7 chimes, one for each vanished student. No one dared enter the old library again. It sealed itself that night, the wood petrified, the hinges rusted shut as though a century had passed in hours. Yet every morning, lights flickered inside. And sometimes, students swore they saw Clara walking the halls in the reflection of trophy cases and windowpanes, never directly, always behind them. Miss Eloan was never mentioned again. Mr. Vale's name was erased from the staff registry. But the door, the true door, remains behind the wall, waiting for the next name to be written. The school remains open. The list has room for more. Some say if you listen closely near room 7's old spot at exactly 10:17 a.m., you'll still hear chalk scratching across wood, writing a name that hasn't yet been spoken aloud. Maybe yours. That was our story for tonight. Do you think it's just an ordinary tale, or is there something more to it? Share your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so you won't miss the next stories. See you, if you still dare to watch next time.